Hi, my name is Bridget Stryker, and I'm with the Boone County Public Library. Welcome to the historic Petersburg Cemetery in the northern part of Boone County, Kentucky. We're here today because we want to talk about the Underground Railroad history and the enslavement history of Boone County, Kentucky. Boone County was a slaveholding county in a slaveholding state. We are surrounded by 39 miles of the Ohio River. Behind me is the major ridgeline going from East Bend, down by Rabbit Hash, all the way up to Petersburg. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was the most widespread and best-selling book of its time. And it talks about enslavement here in Kentucky. An enslaved man named by Washington Parker. He was enslaved by the Parker family who lived behind me on this hill. He knew how to read and write. He was a deacon in his church, and he was well known as a leader within the African American community here. In 1853, he led 27 other people, as well as himself, out of Boone County and up into Canada. Uncle Tom's Cabin was credited as being the reason why they all left, their inspiration for leaving. 28 people all leaving the county at the same time is a huge group. In most cases, it would be nearly impossible. John Fairfield was a white Southerner from a well-known slaveholding family in Virginia. He reportedly was so upset with the thought of enslavement that he helped free some of his own families enslaved and then became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Some say he did it for pay. And in this case, we don't know who paid him to help move 28 individuals across the river and up into Canada, but we know he was here. In March 1853, he posed as a poultry salesman and stayed within the Petersburg area. Remember, Petersburg was a very busy river town. So it wasn't unusual to have somebody come into town and to stay for a little while. And he had an excuse to go to all of the different farms. He eventually became acquainted with Washington Parker, and between the two of them, they managed to get a group together. On April 2nd, 1853, it was rainy, it was wet, the river was high and muddy. The journey of the 28 started here at Boalsburg Baptist Church, the church behind me. It's a historic church dating from 1794. They have always had an African American enslaved membership at this church, going back to about 1795. We believe there was an Easter celebration here that night on April 2nd, so that was the excuse for the entire African American population in the area to get together, to hear services, and probably to hear Wash Parker speak that evening. It would have been a late meeting. The next day, they weren't expected back to their farms until probably later in the day, which allowed them enough opportunity to safely get north from this point. A half mile behind me is the mouth of Garrison Creek, which dumps out into the Ohio River. That is the place where it is documented that the Cincinnati 28 took 3 skiffs and made it across the river to Ohio, right at the mouth of the Great Miami River. The river was swollen. They had the 3 boats, the 3 skiffs. So a skiff is basically like a wooden rowboat, and they'd fit 10 people per boat, and they try to get across the river. The boat that Fairfield was in sunk as they were crossing the river. The 10 people managed to wade the rest of the way. At this time, it was about midnight. They had to go into Cincinnati, and they had to reach Cincinnati before daylight. Everyone was cold and wet and scared. They only had the clothes on their back and maybe some minimal provisions. They had to walk quietly through Ohio along Route 50. There were slave patrols all along the river. Boone County had slave patrols along the river since early as 1804. Near Delhi, it was near dawn, and so they hid in the woods, and John Fairfield went into town, and he met up with the group of conductors in Cincinnati. And he said to them, I have a large group sitting right outside of town. They need your help. There's 28 of them. Levi Coffin and his team were willing to help. They went to the group, gave them coffee and blankets, and they devised a plan. The goal was to get them up to College Hill. College Hill was known as a sanctuary for African Americans on the Underground Railroad. How were they going to do that? They devised a plan where they pretended the group was a part of a funeral procession. And they were moving up through Cincinnati towards an integrated cemetery. Some of the enslaved were in the hearse. Some were mourners following behind. They were pretending to cry, they were pretending to mourn, and they moved their way during the daylight up towards College Hill. Unfortunately, the funeral procession actually became real when the one little baby who went with them didn't live through the first day. The reason why there's just one young child was it was dangerous for women and young children to try to seek freedom, try to escape. Women with nursing children or very young children were a lot slower. It was hard to keep the children quiet, and they're not able to move as quickly as grown men who were physically fit. It is the same reason why we often see the elderly left behind. They're left behind because they can't keep up with the group. And in that case, they have to make a decision whether or not it is better to stay enslaved or to seek freedom, where they're most likely they will die. Can you imagine how that young mother felt? She probably had to leave her parents behind, grandparents of this child who most likely never knew that their grandbaby died, that their grandbaby never made it to freedom, the freedom that they were hoping for this child. They had to keep going. She didn't really have an opportunity to mourn. The child was buried quickly in College Hill. The families, members of the 28 were dispersed throughout the African American community in College Hill. They were hidden in plain sight. You couldn't just put all 28 people in a church in the middle of an Ohio town and think they were going to be safe. So it was a very dangerous thing and very brave for the College Hill community to take all these folks in and hide them. The Sewing Society made them new clothes, they were given shoes, they were given food, and eventually after a few days they were given transportation north. Unfortunately, at that time, the slaveholding families had discovered what happened. They probably figured it out sometime on that Sunday morning the next day, and they started to pursue. At one point on the pursuit, there was a happy accident with one of the wagons that the Freedom Seekers was on. It broke a wheel. When the wheel broke, the whole group had to be diverted from their original route, and they had to seek sanctuary at a nearby Indiana town. Hours later, the slaveholders and the slave catchers went north on the original route that they should have been on, that the Freedom Seekers would have been taking if they had not broken a wheel. Eventually, the families made it up into Michigan. While in Detroit, they were received by a large group of abolitionists and Underground Railroad advocates. They were given all the materials they needed to start over, and eventually they made it safely into Canada. Now, between here and Canada, Windsor, Canada, is about 279 miles. It takes about 4.5 hours in a car. Walking It takes much longer than that. It took about 3 weeks for the whole trip, and they walked and rode in wagons the entire way. Even though they made it to Canada, many times there were people trying to trick the African Americans to come back to the U.S. side of the river so they could be recaptured and taken down south and sold. And life wasn't easy for the African Americans up in Canada. Many didn't know how to read or write, and they didn't know how to keep account books. So even though they were allowed to purchase property and have farms, it was still a struggle for them. We have found that after the Civil War, a lot of times families who left Boone County and made it up into Canada safely would come back into Michigan or into Ohio, or even sometimes come back to Boone County to visit their family. Sometimes they would put ads in the paper asking if anyone knows of their family. That also happened a lot if families were sold on the auction block and they were split up on the auction block. So mothers would put information about their children and who the last known slaveholders were in the records, hoping that somebody knew their children and would be able to make contact with those families. We know that the 28 who left were dearly missed by their families who stayed here in Boone County. We hope that there were connections after the Civil War, but in some cases, once a freedom seeker left, they weren't ever able to go back and they weren't ever able to see their families again. Thank you for joining us today as we look back at the Underground Railroad and enslavement history in Boone County with our affiliate partners for the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom and the National Park Service. If you want more information on Underground Railroad and enslavement history in Boone County, please go to the Boone County Public Library website, www.bcpl.org, and go navigate to the local history page. We have a lot of information on researching the Underground Railroad. We have over 5,000 individuals and related information in a database called African Americans of the Kentucky Borderlands. And so you can hear stories about the Cincinnati 28. You can learn more about the people involved in this escape and other escapes in Boone County and surrounding northern Kentucky area. Thank you for joining us today.